On her wedding day, Imogen Calloway wore pale blue instead of white. Practical, reusable. She didn't know yet that her new husband had already written the papers to end the marriage, before it had even begun. He told his butler it meant nothing. He told himself the same. But some men burn their own escape routes the moment they finally understand what staying might cost them to lose. Theodore, Duke of Renfield, preferred a column of figures to almost anything else in his life. A debt was a clean thing. It had a beginning, a sum, and an end. It did not require sentiment, did not ask to be understood, did not change its mind. He sat now in his London study with the Calloway accounts spread before him, the columns marching down the page in a clerk's careful hand, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that could be solved by writing a number and signing his name beneath it. He had learned young that most things in his life refused to be so simple. A knock. Hartley in the doorway, his expression composed into its usual careful neutrality. "Sir Calloway, your Grace," and his daughter. Theodore set down his pen. "Show them in." Sir Calloway entered first, a stout man whose coat had been good once, and was now merely respectable, his hat held against his chest like a man bracing for bad weather indoors. Behind him came a young woman in grey, perhaps 23, who did not look at the floor the way her father did. "So, your Grace." Sir Calloway bowed too low, too long. "I cannot tell you how deeply I appreciate that is. My family's situation, as you are aware, has been—" "Sit down, Sir Calloway." Theodore gestured to the chairs opposite his desk. "There is no need to apologize for arithmetic." The baronet sat still talking, something about gratitude and honor and the difficulties of the present economy. Theodore let it pass over him the way he let most performed feeling pass over him, and looked instead at the daughter, who had taken the second chair without being invited to, and was looking not at him but at the papers on his desk, upside down to her, reading them anyway. "Miss Calloway." He said it mostly to see what she would do. "Your Grace." She inclined her head precisely as much as propriety required, and not a fraction more. Sir Calloway was still speaking. Something about the sum, about William, about how grateful— "Father?" Imogen's voice was quiet, but it stopped him. "You have the second figure wrong. It is 412, not 420. The Duke's clerk will have the correct sum." A short silence. Sir Calloway blinked at his daughter, then laughed, too loud, covering something. "She has a head for numbers, my Imogen. Her mother's gift, God rest her." Theodore did not laugh. He looked at the young woman in grey, who had not blushed at being noticed, who had simply corrected an error because it was wrong, and felt something shift very slightly out of place in a morning he had expected to be entirely procedural. "Oh, you are correct," he said, 412. "I generally am, Your Grace, where numbers are concerned." She did not say it as a boast. She said it the way one might note the weather. He laid out the terms plainly, because plainness was the only courtesy he knew how to offer in a room like this. The debt-gaming losses, compounded by a bad investment, made in an attempt to recover the first loss, the particulars hardly mattered, would be settled in full. In exchange, an understanding. No formal announcement yet, no contract signed this week, but the clear expectation, communicated honestly, rather than dressed up as anything else, that marriage would follow once the particulars between the families were arranged to everyone's satisfaction. Sir Calloway's relief was so total it was almost embarrassing to witness. He thanked Theodore 4 separate times in the space of 2 sentences, pressed his hand at one point as though Theodore had done him a personal kindness rather than a calculated one, and seemed for a moment genuinely on the verge of further tears. Imogen said nothing for a long moment. Then, "And if I do not consent, Your Grace, when the particulars come to be arranged—" Sir Calloway made a strangled sound, half rising from his chair. "Imogen, the Duke has been more than generous. You cannot mean to—" Theodore held up a hand mildly to quiet him, and looked at her instead. "It is a fair question, Sir Calloway. I would rather answer it honestly than have it sit unasked in the room." He turned back to Imogen. "Then you do not consent. I am not in the business of forcing brides, Miss Calloway. I am in the business of settling debts. The two need not be the same transaction if you find them objectionable." Something crossed her face. Not gratitude, not quite surprise, something more careful than either. "I see. Do you object?" "I have not decided." She met his eyes directly, which her father had not done once in the whole interview. "But I thank you for asking, rather than assuming. Most men in your position would not have troubled themselves with the distinction. Most men in my position have not been corrected on a sum of £8 by the lady they intended to marry, 3 minutes into an acquaintance. A dry note entered his voice, almost despite himself. I find the distinction rather forces itself upon a man, under the circumstances. It was, Theodore thought afterward, an entirely unremarkable thing to say, and yet it stayed with him longer than anything her father had said, all his performed gratitude amounting to less, in the end, than one young woman's plain refusal to pretend she had already decided. "A baronet's daughter," Hartley said after the Calloways had gone, setting a fresh log on the fire with the unhurried economy of a man who had performed the same task 10,000 times. "Sensible, by the look of her. She corrected her father's sums in front of me." Theodore had returned to his desk, though he was not at present looking at anything on it. Without apology. "That would seem sensible, Your Grace, if the sums were wrong." "I did not say it was a fault." "I know, Your Grace." Hartley straightened, brushed a fleck of ash from his sleeve. "You did not." Theodore looked at him for a moment. Hartley, who had stood in this house since before Theodore's father died, who had watched a boy of 19 become a duke in the space of a single terrible week, and had never once, in 11 years, offered an opinion Theodore had not specifically asked for. It was, Theodore had always assumed, simple professionalism. Tonight, it felt, briefly, like something closer to restraint. "You disapprove," he said. "I have formed no opinion to disapprove with, Your Grace." A pause exact in its length. "The debt is settled honourably. The lady is not being deceived as to the terms. I see nothing in it requiring my opinion." "That was not a denial, Hartley." "No, Your Grace." Hartley picked up the empty decanter, turned for the door. "It was not." Theodore let him go without pressing further. It was not, he told himself, a matter that wanted further pressing. A transaction concluded honourably, nothing more complicated than that. He returned to the Calloway papers, intending to file them away with the rest of the household's settled business, and found some minutes later that he had not turned a single page. The Calloway townhouse, when Imogen returned to it that afternoon, smelled faintly of damp and old paper, the particular smell of a house where economies had been practiced for longer than anyone cared to admit aloud. She found her brother in the small back parlour that served as a study, head in his hands over a sheet of figures that bore no resemblance, she suspected, to the ones the Duke's clerk had drawn up. "William!" He looked up. 22, handsome in the unfinished way of young men who have not yet been forced to grow into their own faces, and presently looking very much like a boy caught at something. "Is it settled?" Father said. "It is settled." She sat across from him, did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to. Comfort in this family had a way of becoming permission. "The debt is paid. There is an understanding between myself and the Duke of Renfield that a marriage may follow it." May, she said it carefully. He was plain about the terms. "I am not obligated." He made a point of saying so more than once. William's face did something, complicated relief and shame both, badly hidden. "I never meant for it to come to this, Imogen. The first loss, I thought I could recover it, and then the second wager seemed the only sensible course. And then—" He stopped himself, pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes. "I have made a thorough mess of things. I am not asking you to account for it again." She had heard the accounting 4 times already. She did not require a 5th. "I am asking you to let it be the last time." He nodded, miserable, young. "It will be, I swear it to you, Imogen. I have learned—" "I believe you mean it." She did not say whether she believed the rest. "That will have to be enough for tonight." She rose, crossed to the small writing desk in the corner, and drew out the slim leather ledger she kept there. Not the household accounts proper, which her father nominally oversaw and actually ignored, but her own private record, kept faithfully each night since she was 16, of what the family actually owed and to whom and how much remained. It was not a romantic habit. It was simply the only way she knew to keep the ground from shifting entirely beneath her feet. She opened to a fresh line and wrote, in a hand far steadier than the conversation had been, "Calloway debt to Renfield settled in full this day." Beneath it, after a moment's pause, she added nothing further. There was nothing further yet that she knew to be true. 3 days later, at a private viewing of an exhibition neither of them had particularly wished to attend, Theodore found himself briefly without an audience, Imogen at his side examining a landscape with more attention than it likely deserved. "You did not answer my question," he said. When you asked whether you might refuse, I told you that you might. I did not ask whether you wished to. You did not. She did not look away from the painting. I assumed it was not yet the moment for the question. It is not. I'm asking a different one. He kept his voice low, the gallery half empty around them, no one near enough to overhear. What do you expect, Miss Calloway, if the particulars are arranged as my solicitor and your father both clearly wish them to be? She considered this with the same unhurried precision she had given her father's arithmetic. I do not expect you to love me, Your Grace. That would be a foolish expectation, given the manner of our acquaintance, and I am not given to foolish expectations. She turned finally to look at him directly. I expect honesty. I expect that whatever household I am given, I will be permitted to run it properly, regardless of what either of us feels, or does not feel, about the other. I have run a household on very little before. I am not afraid of doing it again, even less. That is a modest set of expectations, he said when he had recovered himself. It is a realistic one. A small dry edge entered her voice. I find realistic expectations disappoint a great deal less than the other kind. My father has spent 20 years hoping for fortune to arrive by some means other than effort. I have watched what that hope costs a household, Your Grace, and I find I have no appetite left for it. And if I were to disappoint even a realistic expectation, then I should know precisely where I stood, which is more than most wives are afforded. She returned her attention briefly to the painting. I find I would rather have a clear unhappiness than a comfortable uncertainty. The first, at least, one can plan around. He did not have an answer for that. He found walking back to his carriage some 20 minutes later that he was still turning the exchange over, the way he turned over a column of figures that refused to sum correctly. Not because anything in it had been unkind, but because nothing in it had been what he expected a transaction to sound like. He had gone looking for a debt settled. He had found instead a person who had told him precisely what she wanted and asked for nothing more than that, and the difference sat in him uneasily all the way home. The estate correspondence had been sitting on Theodore's desk for 3 days when he finally admitted to himself that he had been keeping it there on purpose. It was not urgent. A tenant matter at Renfield's home farm, a question of drainage and a disputed boundary hedge, the kind of small administrative knot his steward could likely untangle without him. And yet he had thought more than once in those 3 days of Imogen Calloway's voice in the gallery. I am not afraid of doing it again, and had found himself wondering, with a curiosity he did not entirely approve of, whether the claim would survive contact with anything more demanding than her father's arithmetic. He sent for her under the unremarkable pretext of a morning call, and when she arrived prompt, composed, a companion trailing at sufficient distance to satisfy propriety, he simply handed her the steward's letter without preamble. I find I would value a second opinion. She read it standing, did not sit until she had finished, and when she looked up her first words were not about the hedge at all. Your steward has confused the acreage in his second paragraph with the figure in his first. They cannot both be correct. I had not noticed. You were not meant to. He is hoping you will simply approve the larger figure, and he will not be made to explain the discrepancy. She handed the letter back, not without a flicker of something close to amusement. I would write to him directly and ask which figure he intends to stand behind before agreeing to anything. Men of business rarely volunteer their own errors, Your Grace, but they will admit to them readily enough if asked a direct question they cannot avoid. It was, Theodore reflected, exactly the kind of small administrative cunning he ought to have caught himself, and had not. He took the letter back, read it again with her correction in mind, and found she was entirely right. You have done this before, he said, managed accounts of this kind. My father's, badly kept as they are for some years now. She said it without self-pity, a simple fact laid flat on the table between them. One learns to recognize when a man is hoping his numbers will not be examined too closely. It is a particular kind of vagueness, once you have seen it enough times to know its shape. And you have seen it a great many times. More than I should like to count. A small wry pause. Though I find counting is rather the point in the end. Someone in a household must do it, or the household simply ceases to know what is true. He wrote to the steward that afternoon, asking precisely the question she had suggested, and felt, signing his name beneath it, an unfamiliar and not unwelcome sensation, that of having been improved by someone else's mind, without it costing him anything to admit it. The steward's reply 3 days later confirmed the smaller figure exactly as she had predicted, with an apology so transparently rehearsed that Theodore found himself, alone in his study, almost laughing aloud. The near miss came a fortnight later, at a morning call so unremarkable that Theodore would afterwards struggle to recall the hostess's name. Lady Pell-something, a woman of considerable self-regard and a smile that did not reach her eyes, who had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to remark, in front of half a dozen witnesses, on the speed with which the Duke of Renfield's situation had progressed. "One does so admire decisiveness, Your Grace," she said, her gaze sliding to Imogen with the particular brightness of a woman delivering an insult disguised as a compliment. "Though I confess I had not realized that Calloway's circumstances were quite so pressing." A small silence opened in the room, the kind that asked to be filled. 2 other women present exchanged a glance, plainly delighted at the prospect of fresh material for the week's correspondence. Imogen filled it herself before Theodore could speak. "Circumstances are rarely anyone's preferred topic of conversation, Lady Pell. I find decisiveness a kinder subject, don't you?" It was not quite a rebuke. It was precise enough to be one anyway, delivered with a composure that left Lady Pell faintly off balance, smiling in a way that no longer reached anywhere at all. "I only meant," Lady Pell began, and seemed for a moment genuinely uncertain how to finish the sentence she had started. Theodore, a beat behind Imogen, added his own dry weight to the scale. "I find decisiveness saves a great deal of time, certainly. One of its chief virtues, I have always thought, along with sparing a man the tedium of explaining himself to people who have not asked him a direct question." Lady Pell's smile became fixed. She murmured something about fetching more tea, and did not return to that particular corner of the room for the remainder of the call. The conversation moved on, as conversations do, to safer ground, the weather, a forthcoming wedding entirely unconnected to either of them, the price of good silk that season. Outside in the carriage, the 2 of them alone for the first time that day, something in Imogen's careful composure finally cracked not into distress, but into something closer to laughter, quickly suppressed, her hand pressed briefly to her mouth. "Tedious," she managed. You called her tedious to her face in front of her own drawing-room, and she had not the faintest notion how to answer you. I called the subject tedious. I am not responsible if she chose to apply it to herself. How you are not nearly so cold as you would like people to believe, Your Grace." She was still half laughing, unguarded in a way he had not yet seen from her. "I begin to suspect it is mostly performance, this reputation of yours." "And you are not nearly so composed as you would like people to believe," he returned. "If Lady Pell can undo you so thoroughly in private, having failed entirely to undo you in public, that is a very different thing, and you know it. One may hold one's ground and still find the whole business absurd, once the ground has been held." Her laughter faded, not unhappily, into something quieter, a real unguarded ease between them that neither of them, Theodore understood with sudden clarity, had expected to feel this soon, or perhaps at all. They sat with it for a moment, the carriage rattling on toward Berkeley Square. Neither of them speaking, both of them, he suspected, equally unsettled by how little effort the moment had required. The library that same week kept them later than either had intended. The last of the evening's small gathering had gone, a few of Theodore's particular friends, invited more out of obligation than enthusiasm, now departed, and the fire had burned down to its last honest heat. Imogen had taken up a book she did not appear to be reading. Theodore, across from her, found he had no genuine excuse left to remain in the room, and made none of the usual efforts to manufacture one. "Tell me something true," he said, "that has nothing to do with debts or households or arrangements." She looked up, surprised by the bluntness of it, such as, "What you wanted, before any of this." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the whole architecture of the last month. "Before William's debts, before my solicitor, before any of it. What did you want at 16, 17, when you still imagined you might choose?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might decline to answer at all. Then, "I wanted to travel. Italy mostly. I had read every account of it I could find, badly translated half of them, and I used to imagine I would see it myself one day properly, not through someone else's letters." A small rueful smile. It seemed at 16 an entirely reasonable ambition. One simply had not yet done the arithmetic on what it would require. "I have grown rather practical since." "You might still." "I might." She did not sound convinced, though I find ambitions have a way of narrowing themselves to fit whatever room one is actually standing in. I have grown rather good at small rooms. There is a certain dignity to it, I have decided, if one refuses to resent the room itself. That seems a very deliberate kind of contentment. It is the only kind available to most people, Your Grace. I find it serves better than waiting for the other kind, which has a way of never arriving precisely when one expects it. He considered this, and considered too how much of himself he was prepared to offer in return. My father died when I was 19. Suddenly an apoplexy, no warning at all. 1 week he was teaching me to manage the home farm, and the next I was burying him and being addressed as Your Grace by men twice my age, who plainly did not believe I was equal to it. He stopped. He had not meant to say this much. I learned very quickly that the only thing I could actually control was... He stopped again, more deliberately this time, aware he had been about to say something he was not prepared to finish. Imogen did not push. She simply watched him, waiting, and when it became clear he did not intend to complete the thought, she let the silence close over it gently, without comment, the way one might close a door someone else had opened only part way. It was, Theodore thought, its own kind of intimacy, not the words she might have asked for, but the grace of not asking for them. Mrs. Bellamy's drawing room the following afternoon was considerably warmer than the weather outside warranted, owing chiefly to the fire she insisted on keeping built up regardless of season, and to the particular heat of her attention once she had decided a subject merited it. "How you have gone quiet on me," she said, pouring tea with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had buried one husband and outlived most of his disapproving relations. "You used to tell me everything, Imogen, down to the last tedious detail of your father's mismanagement. Now I ask after the Duke and you give me weather." "There is little to tell. There is a great deal to tell, judging by your face, which is doing entirely too much work to convince me otherwise." Mrs. Bellamy set down the teapot, fixed her niece with the look that had, in Imogen's experience, never once failed to extract the truth. "Does it still feel only a transaction to you?" Imogen opened her mouth to say yes, and found to her own quiet surprise that the word would not quite come. "He is not what I expected," she said instead, carefully, as though testing the weight of each word before committing to it. "I expected coldness, or indifference dressed as courtesy. I did not expect—" She stopped. "Did not expect to find yourself thinking of him," her aunt supplied, not unkindly. "Rather more than the arrangement strictly requires." "I did not say that." "You did not need to." Mrs. Bellamy's smile was dry, fond, entirely unsentimental. "I have known you since you were in short skirts, my dear. You have never once blushed over a column of figures, however large the sum, and you are blushing now at the mere mention of a man's name." "I am not blushing." "You are rather charmingly, and I shall not torment you further about it." Her aunt's tone gentled just slightly. "I will only say this, Imogen, and then I shall let the matter rest. You have spent your whole life managing other people's mistakes so carefully that you have never once permitted yourself a feeling you had not first approved in advance. There is nothing wrong with that, as a method of surviving a difficult household. But a marriage is not a household ledger, however much you might wish it to behave like one." Imogen said nothing further, which was, they both understood, its own kind of confession. He arrived to walk her home from her aunt's that evening, rather than send the carriage, an unnecessary courtesy he did not examine too closely before offering it. Dusk had settled over the square, the lamplighters not yet come, the street caught in that particular grey hour where faces become harder to read and easier to mean something by. "You needn't have come yourself," Imogen said as they fell into step. "I wished to." He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. They walked in a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with something neither of them had named. The library conversation still sitting between them, his unfinished sentence, her grace in not finishing it for him. At the corner, where the street narrowed and the nearest lamp had not yet been lit, she stopped to adjust her glove, and he stopped because she had, and for a moment neither of them moved on. Theodore. It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it the way one notices a held breath finally released. Imogen. Neither of them said anything further. He was not certain afterward which of them moved first, only that the distance between them, the careful 3 inches they had maintained through every public room and every carriage ride for the better part of a month, simply ceased to exist, and his hand was at her jaw and her glove finally was touching his sleeve. The kiss was brief, restrained, the kind of thing that might to a passing stranger have looked like nothing at all. two figures pausing on a darkening street corner for the length of a breath. But it landed in both of them with a weight entirely disproportionate to its length, and when it ended, neither moved away quickly, both of them very still, very aware of what had just been true between them that had not been true a moment before. "I beg your pardon," he said finally, though it was not clear which of them he was apologizing to. "You needn't." Her voice was not quite steady. "I did not object." Neither of them said anything else of substance the rest of the way to her father's door. They spoke instead of the cold, of the lamplighters, of nothing at all. The easy performed conversation of two people who had just discovered something neither was yet prepared to name aloud, and who had, by unspoken and mutual agreement, decided that silence on the subject was safer, for now, than honesty. The morning after, both of them were careful in ways the household could not help but notice. Theodore took breakfast alone earlier than his habit, and was at his desk before the post had even arrived, reviewing correspondence with an intensity that had nothing whatsoever to do with its contents. When Hartley inquired mildly whether anything was amiss, Theodore informed him, with rather more formality than the question warranted, that nothing whatsoever was amiss, and would he see that the morning post was brought directly. Hartley withdrew without comment, though Theodore caught just before the door closed something in the old man's expression that might, in a less disciplined servant, have been the beginning of a knowing look. Imogen, for her part, wrote 3 letters that morning and tore up 2 of them, and told her aunt, when Mrs. Bellamy called unexpectedly and inquired after her unusually high colour, that she had simply walked too quickly the previous evening and felt the effects of it still. Mrs. Bellamy, who had buried one husband and was not easily deceived by nieces, said nothing further on the subject, and contented herself with a very small, very knowing smile over the rim of her teacup. "Walked too quickly," she repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "Yes, I am sure that is precisely what happened." The terms were finalized within the week. Sir Calloway and Theodore's solicitor closeted together for the better part of an afternoon, the particulars of settlement and contract drawn up with the same precision Theodore brought to every transaction in his life, except that this one, for the first time, did not feel entirely like a transaction at all. A date was set, 6 weeks hence. Theodore had already secured a special license from Doctors' Commons, sparing them the public reading of bans that propriety would otherwise have demanded of lesser families, though 6 weeks remained necessary regardless, for the dressmaker, for all the small machinery of a wedding to be properly assembled. Imogen was present for part of the discussion, summoned to confirm a detail of her own settlement, and found herself watching the mechanics of her own marriage being arranged on paper with a strange, removed clarity, as though observing someone else's life being decided in the next room, the murmured voices of men deciding things that were, in fact, entirely hers. She noted, with the same precision she brought to her own ledger, the exact figure of her jointure, the terms of her widow's portion, the clause concerning any children of the match. Each one a fact to be recorded, rather than a feeling to be indulged, though she found by the end of the afternoon that the distinction was rather harder to maintain than it had been a month before. She caught Theodore's eye once across the desk, while her father was occupied with a clause about her jointure. Neither of them smiled, neither looked away quickly either. That night in her own room, she opened her ledger and wrote, beneath the earlier entry about the settled debt, "Marriage now fixed by contract, 6 weeks hence." She paused, pen still touching the page, and after a long moment added one further line, smaller than the rest, as though she could not quite commit to it in full ink. "He kissed me on Albemarle Street, and I have not stopped thinking of it since." She closed the book before she could read it back and decide it was foolish. The Ashworth ball, a fortnight before the wedding, was the first occasion on which Theodore and Imogen appeared together as the publicly acknowledged betrothed couple of the season. The engagement formally announced, no longer a matter of private understanding, but common, comfortable London knowledge. London. It should have been, by every measure Theodore understood, a triumph. The debt settled honourably, the match approved on all sides, a bride whose composure and intelligence reflected well on his judgment rather than poorly. Lady Ashworth herself remarked with evident sincerity on what a fine couple they made, and steered no fewer than 3 separate matrons toward Imogen over the course of the evening, plainly eager to display her own role in the season's most satisfactory match. Theodore found he could not enjoy a moment of it. He watched Imogen across the ballroom, managing a circle of older women with the same unhurried precision she brought to his steward's letters, and felt something close in his chest that he did not have an immediate name for, not quite panic, not quite dread, but some cousin of both, the sensation of a man watching a door close behind him that he had not entirely chosen to walk through. The kiss. The ledger he did not know existed but might have guessed at. The unfinished sentence in the library that he had stopped himself from completing and had thought of uselessly every night since. This was not a transaction any longer. He had wanted a transaction. He had built his entire adult life since the week his father died on the principle that transactions could be controlled and feelings could not, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks the two had become indistinguishable, and he did not know how to want that without also fearing it entirely. He made his excuses earlier than courtesy strictly allowed, and went home. Hartley was in the study when Theodore arrived, banking the fire for the night with the same unhurried economy he brought to every task, and looked up only briefly when the door opened. "You are home early, Your Grace." Theodore did not answer immediately. He crossed to the sideboard, poured a drink he did not, in the end, particularly want, and stood holding it without drinking, looking at nothing in particular. "It is a successful match," he said finally. "Sir Calloway is satisfied, my solicitor is satisfied. Lady Ashworth herself called us a fine couple this evening, as though that settles the matter entirely. That would seem a fortunate outcome, Your Grace." Hartley straightened from the fire, brushed ash from his sleeve. "It is a fortunate outcome." Theodore turned the glass in his hand, still not drinking from it. "This marriage will mean nothing to me, Hartley. Whatever else may be said of it, the settlement is sound, the lady is sensible, the whole business has been conducted with perfect propriety. It is at its foundation a debt discharged. Nothing more than that. I would not have either of us mistake it for something it is not." He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided to believe, rather than a thing he has found to be true too precisely, too much like an argument addressed to an audience of one. The room was very quiet after he finished speaking. Hartley did not answer at once. He finished banking the fire, set the poker back in its stand with exact unhurried care, and only then straightened fully to face the room. "Very good, Your Grace," he said. It was, on its surface, perfect agreement. It was also, Theodore understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, nothing of the kind. Hartley's face had not changed, his voice had not changed. And yet something in the particular stillness with which he said it, the absence of anything further, the refusal to so much as glance toward the glass Theodore had not yet drunk from made plain, more eloquently than any argument could have, that he did not believe a single word of what he had just heard. "That will be all, Hartley." "Yes, Your Grace." He bowed precisely as much as the moment required and left. Theodore stood alone in the study for a long time after the door closed, the drink still untouched in his hand, turning over what he had said and what Hartley had not said in return, and finding, to his considerable discomfort, that the silence had told him a good deal more about himself than he had intended anyone to learn that night, including, perhaps especially, himself. She did not hear the words. That was, in its way, the cruelty of it. There was no single sentence she could point to, no overheard remark she might have confronted him with directly. There was only the change that followed, arriving in increments small enough that each one, taken alone, might have meant nothing at all. Their call shortened by 10 minutes, with a perfectly reasonable excuse attached to it. A letter that had been, the week before, 3 full pages, now barely 1, and signed with rather less warmth than its predecessors. An evening at the theatre where he sat beside her and spoke perhaps a dozen words the entire performance, his attention fixed on the stage with an intensity that felt, to her careful and increasingly practiced eye, like a man avoiding something rather than a man genuinely absorbed. By the end of the week, Imogen no longer needed to wonder whether something had changed. She knew it the way she knew a column of figures was wrong before she had finished checking the some instinct beneath calculation, immediate and certain. She did not confront him. That was not, she told herself, pride exactly, though it was, if she were entirely honest in her own ledger, a great deal like pride. It was simpler than that, and harder to argue with. If he had decided, after Albemarle Street, after the library, after everything that had passed unspoken between them, that this was still and only a transaction, then she would not be the one left exposed by having said otherwise first. She wrote in her ledger that night, the entry brief almost clinical, the kind of line she might have used for any other debt. Whatever was said on Albemarle Street, He has plainly reconsidered it. I will not chase what is being withdrawn." She closed the book and did not open it again for several days. The wedding was 11 days away. Neither of them in all that time said a single word to the other about what either of them actually felt, and both of them, in their separate houses, in their separate silences, were certain they already knew. The church was small old. The kind St. George's parishioners would have considered beneath their notice, and Theodore had chosen it for precisely that reason. Fewer witnesses, less performance required of either of them. It did not in the end spare them much. Imogen stood at the altar in pale blue rather than white. A practical choice, her aunt's suggestion, something that could be worn again, and Theodore watched her come up the short aisle on her father's arm and found his hand was not entirely steady where it rested at his side. He had not expected that. He had expected, if anything, the same controlled efficiency with which he approached every other significant transaction of his life. Sir Calloway's eyes were wet before the ceremony had properly begun. William stood near the front, looking, for once, less like a boy who had caused a crisis, and more like a young man genuinely glad of how it had resolved. Mrs. Bellamy occupied the front pew on the bride's side, with the upright posture of a woman determined not to weep, and visibly losing the battle, her gloved hands clasped so tightly together that the leather had begun to crease at the knuckle. The vows themselves were brief, the words ancient and worn smooth by 10,000 other couples who had said them before. Theodore spoke his clearly, evenly, the practiced voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Imogen's voice caught only once on the word cherish, the smallest hesitation, gone almost before it registered, and he heard it anyway, and something in his chest tightened that he did not examine closely enough to name. Neither of them looked at the other longer than the ceremony required. Neither of them looked away faster than courtesy demanded either. When the rector pronounced them married, the small congregation's polite applause felt to Theodore oddly distant, as though it were happening to someone else, in some other church, while he stood very still beside a woman he had kissed once on a darkening street corner, and had not spoken to honestly since. The wedding breakfast was brief, efficient, exactly as much performance as the occasion demanded, and not a moment more. Sir Calloway made a toast that ran rather longer than necessary, touched on his late wife twice, and ended unexpectedly in genuine tears that he did not seem at all ashamed of. Mrs. Bellamy pressed Imogen's hand at the door, said nothing, which from her aunt was its own kind of eloquence. William shook Theodore's hand, with a gravity that suggested he understood, finally, the size of what his sister had agreed to absorb on his behalf, and said, low enough that only Theodore caught it, that he meant to prove himself worth the cost of it, however long that took. By early afternoon they were in the carriage, London already behind them, the city giving way by degrees to hedgerows and open fields, and the silence between them settled in almost immediately, not hostile, but careful, the silence of two people who had just made permanent promises to each other, and had not yet found a way to speak, as though either of them believed it. Renfield, when they arrived as dusk was settling, was older and larger, and considerably quieter than anything London had prepared Imogen for. Grey stone softened by ivy, the long drive flanked by oaks that had clearly stood there since long before any Duke of Renfield had been born to inherit them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, met them at the door with the brisk, slightly anxious efficiency of a woman who had been managing this household alone for some time, and was not entirely certain how much of it she would now be required to surrender. Imogen, taking in the hall the faded wallpaper in the east corridor, the silver that wanted polishing, the household ledgers, Mrs. Fenwick mentioned with visible relief at finally having someone to hand them to, felt something in herself settle that had nothing to do with the marriage and everything to do with the simple, familiar pleasure of a problem that could be solved by paying close attention to it. "I shall want to see the household accounts in the morning, Mrs. Fenwick," she said, already removing her gloves, "and the still-room inventory, if one has been kept." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Fenwick's relief was almost comic in its transparency. "It will be a pleasure, Your Grace, having someone to that is. I have done my best, but a house this size truly wants a mistress's eye, and his lordship has had his hands rather full elsewhere these 11 years. Theodore, standing slightly apart, watched his wife take possession of his household, within minutes of arriving in it, with the same unhurried competence she had once brought to his steward's confused acreage, and felt again that same uncomfortable mixture. He had not yet found a name for admiration. tangled inseparably with something closer to fear. The first days established a rhythm that was, on its surface, entirely correct, and underneath that surface entirely empty. Breakfast was taken at the same hour each morning, in near silence, each of them occupied with correspondence that required rather less attention than either pretended. Dinner was 4 courses, properly served, conversation confined to the weather, the tenants, the state of the home farm, nothing that risked straying anywhere near Albemarle Street, or the library, or the days of his retreat that had preceded their wedding. Evenings, more often than not, found them in separate rooms by unspoken and mutual agreement, each telling themselves it was simply prudent, a marriage finding its proper shape. Imogen threw herself into the household with a thoroughness that left Mrs. Fenwick faintly astonished, and the account books within a week considerably more accurate than they had been in years. She began, too, the habit she had kept since 16, her ledger, reopened each night, no longer recording her father's debts but Renfield's instead, a private record of a household she was building competently and largely alone. Mrs. Fenwick, within days, had stopped making decisions of any consequence without first consulting the new Duchess, a deference she extended without seeming to notice she had begun extending it. Theodore noticed, because Theodore noticed everything about her now, however much he told himself he was not looking. He noticed the candle still burning in her room some nights when he passed in the corridor, later than the household's other lamps. He noticed that she had reorganized the stillroom within 4 days, and the linen inventory within 6, and that Mrs. Fenwick had begun, without seeming to realize it, deferring to the new Duchess's judgment on matters she had managed alone for a decade. He told himself this was simply efficiency. He did not entirely believe it, even as he told himself. The storm arrived on the 9th day, sudden and violent enough to trap half the outdoor staff in the stables and send Mrs. Fenwick scurrying to secure shutters that had not needed securing in years. Theodore, returning from the home farm soaked through and later than he intended, found the great hall in a state of mild, well-managed chaos, and found Imogen at the center of it, directing 2 footmen toward a leak in the east corridor, with the same calm precision she brought to everything. "You're soaked through," she said when she saw him, the first genuinely unguarded thing she had said to him in days. "I had not accounted for the weather." "No one accounts for English weather, Your Grace. It is the one constant failure of every plan ever made in this country." A flicker of the dry wit he had not heard from her since London. "Go and change before you catch your death. I have the leak in hand." He went and changed, and came back down some 20 minutes later to find the immediate crisis resolved, the footmen dispersed, and Imogen alone in the small sitting room nearest the kitchens, the fire built up against the storm still raging outside, a tray of tea gone cold beside her. "You needn't have waited," he said. "I wasn't waiting, I was thinking." She did not look up immediately. "There is a difference, Your Grace, though I grant the 2 can look similar from the doorway." He sat, because there was nowhere else in the small room to be that did not feel deliberately, awkwardly distant, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the storm filling the silence where conversation might otherwise have gone. "You manage this house as though you have always belonged to it," he said finally. "I manage it because someone must, and Mrs. Fenwick was glad enough to let me." She set down her cold tea. "It does not require belonging, Your Grace, only attention." "I think that is not entirely true." He had not meant to say it. It came out anyway, low, more honest than anything he had offered her since Albemarle Street. "I think you have made this house better in 9 days than I managed in 11 years, and I do not think attention alone accounts for that." She looked at him then, properly, the first time either of them had held the other's gaze for longer than courtesy required since the wedding. "And what do you think accounts for it, Your Grace?" He did not answer. The storm answered for him, a long roll of thunder that gave him an excuse to look away, and the moment, charged and unfinished, was allowed to pass without resolution, both of them, he suspected, equally aware of how close they had come to honesty, and equally unwilling yet to close the final distance. It was 3 days later, the 12th of their residence at Renfield, though neither of them was counting so precisely, or admitted to it if they were searching for a household ledger Mrs. Fenwick had misplaced, that Theodore found Imogen's instead. It was sitting on the small writing desk in her sitting room, left open not carelessly, he understood, simply because she had not expected him to enter that particular room while she was at the stables overseeing some matter with the new mare. He should not have read it. He told himself this clearly in the moment, and read it anyway, his eye catching first on the practical entries, the still-room inventory, a note about the home farm's drainage, the kind of competent record-keeping he had come to expect from her. And then, further back, an entry he recognized the date of without needing to calculate it. He kissed me on Albemarle Street, and I have not stopped thinking of it since. Further still, closer to the wedding, whatever was said on Albemarle Street, he has plainly reconsidered it. I will not chase what is being withdrawn. He closed the book carefully, exactly as he had found it, and stood in the small sitting room for a long moment, something in his chest that felt very much like the floor giving way beneath a structure he had thought, until that moment, was built on solid ground. She had not imagined the kiss meant nothing. She had decided instead that he had reconsidered it, had felt him withdraw in the days before the wedding, and concluded, with the same precise, unsentimental logic she brought to every column of figures, that the withdrawal was a verdict rather than a panic. She had matched his retreat with one of her own, not out of indifference but out of the same wounded pride he recognized, uncomfortably, as his own. He said nothing of what he had found that evening. He sat instead through a dinner he barely tasted, answered questions about the tenants with answers he did not afterward remember giving, and understood, lying awake long after the household had gone quiet, that the matter could not be left where it stood for very much longer. It was Imogen who finally broke the silence the following evening, in his study after the household had retired for the night. She did not knock first. She simply entered, closed the door behind her, and stood with the particular stillness of a woman who had decided something and did not intend to be talked out of it before she had said her piece. "I should like to understand something, Your Grace." He set down his pen. "Theodore." "Theodore, then." She did not soften at the correction. "You kissed me on Albemarle Street. You said nothing of it for 11 days, and then you grew cold before the wedding, in increments small enough that I could not name a single moment to point to, only the accumulation of all of them together. I have lived in this house with you for nearly a fortnight more, and I find I am still waiting for an explanation that has not come." "Imogen." "I am not finished." Her voice did not rise. It simply held, level and exact. "You pull away precisely when something begins to feel real. The night after the kiss, the days before our wedding, every evening in this house since, when something almost passes between us, and you find some reason to look away first. I should like to know why, and I find I am no longer willing to wait quietly for you to decide whether I deserve the answer." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, it was slower than his usual register, a man choosing each word with the care of someone laying down something fragile. "My father died when I was 19. Suddenly an apoplexy, no warning given to either of us. One week he was teaching me to walk the home farm boundaries. The next I was burying him. And the week after that, men twice my age were calling me Your Grace and waiting to see whether I would fail." "You did not fail." "I did not fail because I learned very quickly that the only thing I could actually control was myself, my decisions. The columns of a ledger, which behave predictably if you manage them correctly, unlike grief, unlike a household suddenly without its master, unlike anything that requires you to trust another person not to disappear." He looked at her directly now. "Within the first fortnight of our understanding, before either of us had any reason to imagine this would become anything more than a debt discharged, I sat down one evening and drafted notes. The grounds I might claim, the questions I would put to ecclesiastical council, should I ever wish to be free of the arrangement. Nothing filed, nothing a court would ever have seen. Private pages in my own hand, meant for no one's eyes but mine." She went very still. "You intended to use them?" "No." He said it immediately, without hesitation. "That is the truth I find hardest to explain, even to myself. I never intended to consult a soul about them. I wrote them because having them in a drawer gave me the sense that I still controlled my own life, that whatever this marriage became, I had not surrendered the one thing I had spent 11 years protecting. They were never meant for you. They were meant for me. A kind of insurance I did not actually want to collect on. And the kiss. The kiss frightened me precisely because it was real." His voice had gone quieter still. "I had built an entire understanding of myself around the idea that this marriage was a transaction I controlled. After Albemarle Street, I could no longer pretend that was true, and I did not know how to want something I could not control without also fearing it entirely. So I retreated. I told myself it was prudence. It was in truth simple cowardice, dressed up as restraint." He paused and made himself say the rest of it unprompted, because he understood, finally, that the worst of it was his to offer, and not hers to discover by accident. The night of the Ashworth ball I told Hartley the marriage would mean nothing to me. I said it to make true by speaking it aloud, something I no longer believed even as I spoke it. He did not believe me either. I understood that the moment I finished speaking, and I have not been able to forget the particular quality of his silence since. The study was very quiet. The fire had burned low, neither of them having tended it, and for a long moment Imogen said nothing at all, simply looking at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "I have been protecting my own pride as deliberately as you have been protecting yours," she said finally. "I did not chase you after the wedding because I told myself it was dignity. It was also fear. The fear of offering something honest to a man who had already, as I believed, decided I was not worth the risk of honesty in return. You were never that to me." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Not for a single day since the gallery, when you told me you expected nothing but honesty and the freedom to be competent. I have wanted every day since to be the kind of man who could simply tell you that, and I did not know how until tonight forced the question past whatever I had built to keep it contained." She was quiet for a moment, turning something over. "And what would you have done, Theodore, if I had never found that ledger entry written and never confronted you tonight? Would you have told me any of this in time? Or would we have gone on as we were, each of us certain of the other's indifference for years rather than weeks?" It was a fair question, and he did not answer it quickly. "I do not know," he admitted. "I should like to believe I would have found the courage eventually. I am not at all certain that is true. I have spent 11 years rewarding myself for control and have had very little practice at the alternative." "Then I am glad I found the ledger entry," she said, "however little credit either of us can take for the manner of its discovery. The private pages were in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a layer of older correspondence he had not disturbed in months. He retrieved them without being asked, set them on the desk between them, and Imogen looked at his own careful, private handwriting dates, half-formed legal questions, the cold architecture of an ending neither of them, it was now clear, had ever truly wanted. "May I?" she asked. He nodded, and watched her take the pages in her own hands, read enough of them to understand their shape and then hand them back without comment, her expression unreadable except for the steadiness with which she held his gaze. He crossed to the fireplace, knelt, and fed the pages into the low-banked fire one sheet at a time, watching his own handwriting curl and blacken and vanish. It was a small, unspectacular action. There was no grand speech in it, no further explanation required beyond everything already spoken in the last quarter hour. The pages simply burned, and when the last sheet had caught and curled to ash, he remained kneeling a moment longer, watching the fire settle, before he rose and turned back to her. "I do not need the insurance any longer," he said. "I have not, I think, for some time. I was simply too proud to admit it." Imogen crossed the room to him, the distance between them closing for the second time since Albemarle Street. Not careful this time, not 3 measured inches maintained for the benefit of some imagined audience, but simply gone, her hand finding his where it still bore the faint warmth of the fire. "Then we are agreed," she said, "that pride is a poor substitute for honesty." "We are agreed." The kiss that followed bore no resemblance to the restrained, startled thing on Albemarle Street. It was slower, surer, neither of them retreating into propriety afterward, neither of them pretending the moment had not happened. They sat together by the dying fire for a long while after, her hand in his arms settled around her with the unguarded ease of 2 people who had finally stopped performing a marriage and begun instead simply living one warm, unhurried, entirely without the careful distance that had defined every room they had shared until that night. "I think," she said sometime later, her head resting against his shoulder, the fire burned down to embers, "that I should like to see Italy after all, one day, not alone, as I once imagined it, with my husband, if he can be persuaded." "I find," Theodore said, "that I am rather easily persuaded where you are concerned. I have been, I suspect, for some months now. A little over 3 years on, Renfield in early summer was a different house than the one Imogen had first entered in pale blue, soaked with nerves she had not let herself name. The east corridor no longer leaked. The household ledgers, kept now in a hand that had grown steadier and more confident with each passing year, recorded a home farm in better order than it had been in living memory, and a duchess whose judgment Mrs. Fenwick had long since stopped second-guessing and started simply trusting. The promised journey to Italy had come to pass 2 summers prior, a wedding gift Theodore had insisted upon the moment the harvest accounts allowed it, and Imogen still kept, pressed between the pages of her ledger, a single dried flower from a garden outside Florence that meant nothing to anyone but the 2 of them. In the great hall on a particular bright morning, a small wooden horse lay abandoned precisely where someone was certain to trip over it, and Cora, not yet 4, dark-haired like her father, possessed of her mother's exact and unhurried way of correcting anyone she judged to be wrong, was presently engaged in helping a long-suffering footman polish the silver, her small hands accomplishing rather less than she believed they were. "You've missed a spot, Thomas," she informed him, with the particular gravity of a small girl who has heard her mother say something similar and understood it to be both true and important. "Mama says one must look properly, not just quickly." "Quite right, your ladyship," Thomas said with admirable solemnity, and polished the spot again. In the study, the same room where 3 years before, Theodore had once told Hartley that a marriage would mean nothing to him, and had not believed a word of it, even as he spoke it. Imogen sat now beside her husband, rather than across from him, both of them bent over the same household ledger, the infant heir asleep against her shoulder, one small fist curled in the fabric of her gown. "The home farm accounts again," Theodore observed, glancing at the familiar steady hand filling the page. "I begin to think you enjoy them more than I do." "I enjoy that they behave predictably if managed correctly." She did not look up, but there was warmth in it now where once there might have been only precision. "I learned that principle from a man who once told me he preferred a column of figures to almost anything else in his life." That man, Theodore said, had not yet met his wife. She glanced up at that, something easy and unguarded passing between them. No careful distance left to maintain, no performance required for any audience, simply 2 people who had built, slowly and honestly, exactly the kind of household she had once told him, in a gallery in London, that she intended to run properly regardless of what either of them felt. They had come, in the end, to feel a great deal. Neither of them any longer needed to say so aloud for it to be entirely true. Cora appeared in the doorway, the abandoned wooden horse now recovered and clutched against her chest, and announced with the gravity of a much older child delivering important news that Thomas had finished the silver, and she had helped ever so much. "I'm certain you did," Imogen said, and held out her free arm, and Cora climbed up beside her mother with the easy confidence of a child who had never once known this house to be anything but warm. Hartley found them there some while later, bringing in the afternoon post with the same unhurried economy he had brought to every task in this household for some 15 years now, and paused a moment longer than strictly necessary in the doorway before announcing himself. The Duke and Duchess, heads bent together over a ledger, neither of them was reading with any particular urgency. The young lady Cora, curled against her mother's side, already half asleep in the warm afternoon light. The infant boy who would in time inherit it all, the Earl of Calder, by courtesy of his father's lesser title, though at present he was sleeping soundly, entirely undisturbed by a household that had, in Hartley's considerable experience, become a genuinely happy one. "The post, Your Grace," he said, setting it on the corner of the desk. Theodore looked up. "Thank you, Hartley." "Will that be all, Your Grace?" "It will." A pause, and then with a small dry warmth that had not been part of his register 3 years before. "Though I find I owe you a debt of some standing, Hartley, for a silence you once offered me that I did not at the time particularly thank you for." Hartley's expression did not change a great deal. It rarely did, but something in the set of his mouth suggested unmistakably that he understood precisely what was being referenced, and was, in his own quiet and entirely unsentimental way, content with how it had resolved. "I am glad to hear it, Your Grace," he said. He hesitated the smallest pause before adding, "I find a household runs considerably better, Your Grace, when its master no longer requires my silence to disagree with him." "That is the closest I believe you have ever come to an outright opinion, Hartley." "I should not like to make a habit of it, Your Grace." But there was something almost approaching warmth in the old butler's bow before he left them to the rest of the afternoon. That evening the children settled and the house gone quiet around them. Theodore and Imogen sat together by the fire in the small sitting room nearest the kitchens. The same room, the storm-soaked evening 3 years before, where she had told him attention alone did not account for what she had built in this house, and he had not yet been honest enough to answer her properly. There was no careful distance between them now. No measured 3 inches maintained for some imagined audience. No performance left anywhere in the marriage worth keeping up. Her head rested against his shoulder. His hand, unhurried, moved idly over hers where it lay against his chest, and neither of them spoke for a long while, the fire settling, the house entirely still around them. "Do you ever think of Albemarle Street?" she asked finally into the quiet. "Often?" He pressed a kiss, light and unhurried, to the crown of her head. "Though I find I no longer need to think of it as the beginning of anything uncertain. Only as the first honest moment in a marriage that has given me a great many more since." She tilted her face up to his, and the distance between them, the small remaining inch that habit alone might still have maintained, simply ceased to exist, nothing held back, nothing performed, only the quiet, complete closeness of two people who had finally, after every careful retreat and every reluctant honesty, arrived somewhere true.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.